First, I want you to welcome Nani Wolf. Nani is an urban planner based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where she currently works for Ann Arbor's Downtown Development Authority. Nani has worked on long-range planning projects for communities throughout Michigan, and she has specialized experience in aging in place, accessibility, and parking. Nani is a longtime member of the Parking Reform Network, and as a volunteer, was lead author of this first edition of our policy cookbook. So please react. I love Zoom reactions. So if you also love Zoom reactions, please react with the applauses to welcome Nani. Yay. Okay, I want to welcome now Danny Harden-Ramella. Danny Harden-Ramella is a graduate student studying urban and regional planning at Portland State University, set to graduate in summer 2026. Danny, infinitely employable, centers environmental justice and public health at the core of their work. By combining MURP planning knowledge with technical skills in GIS and spatial analysis, Danny aims to serve communities through the lens of spatial justice and climate equity. So more reactions for Danny. Yay. And now, Daniel Herriges, who's our policy director. Daniel Herriges is our policy director here at the Parking Reform Network, where he works with our partner organizations to accelerate critical parking reforms through education, organizing, coalition building, and direct advocacy. Prior to coming to PRN, Daniel was editor-in-chief at Strong Towns, and he is a co-author of the book Escaping the Housing Trap. Daniel has a master's in urban planning from the University of Minnesota, and he lives in St. Paul, Minnesota. So with this all said, I'll hand it over to Daniel, and I will stop sharing. Thanks for the speakers for being here with us today.
And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm gonna introduce the policy cookbook. We'll take a little bit, try to keep this brief and get to whatever questions you all have, but I wanna showcase this new tool that we're very proud to finally have launched and have available to the public, talk a little bit about what we were trying to accomplish with it, and then what's next for it as well. Um, and then I'm really happy to have Nani and Danny here because they were the ones who really did a whole lot of the work. This absolutely would not have happened without either of them. So I'm happy to celebrate their hard work on this project. Um, I am going to share a couple slides here. I don't have much of a presentation because the presentation kind of is the cookbook, and I will directly screen share from that in a minute here. But just to talk about what this resource is. And if you haven't already grabbed it for yourself, it is available on our site at parkingreform.org/resources/cookbook. You just have to put in your email address. We don't spam you. If you're at this event, you're probably already on our mailing list. It does add you to the mailing list if you're somehow not. You should be anyway. Our newsletter is great. But anyway, yeah, you provide your email, you get a link to download. And I ask that, first of all, I ask that you do share the cookbook with your networks, groups that you're involved with, but also that you share the link as opposed to the PDF itself, because this is something that's going to be a living resource. And the most up-to-date version of it will always be the one available on our site. Without further ado, so this is a collection of policy recipes for parking reform going beyond the issue of just parking mandates. And one of the reasons we wanted to do this is that we've had a goal as an organization to really expand PRN's thought leadership beyond the thing that we're most known for, which is our advocacy for the elimination of costly parking mandates, to everything else that comprises parking reform. And that's maybe a little bit more local, a little bit more situational, a little bit more nuanced. How do you manage your curbs effectively? How do you deal with conflicts over the use of space at the curb? How do you actually disincentivize excess parking beyond just getting rid of the mandates and say you have to build more than you want? So we want to really beef up our guidance in those areas. We're getting a lot of requests from our partners and our members to do that. And to document success stories. We know where some of the innovation is happening in these areas. But it's such a niche thing. We want to tell those stories, and we want to be the place that you come to find out what's working and who's doing stuff that's cool. and ultimately to create a resource that is non-technical, but that is a good conversation starter for policy innovation and for spreading policy innovations to other places. So really the target audience for this is local advocates and local elected officials. These case studies are meant to be an accessible kind of thing that you could bring to your city council member, to a planning commissioner, that you could use to start a conversation about what if we thought a little bit differently about parking in our public realm. Um, so you're not going to see a lot of planning jargon in this. You don't have to be a parking policy practitioner to use this. It's really meant for everyone. Um, each recipe in the cookbook provides a little bit of context on the community that we're profiling. It provides a basic sort of conceptual overview of what is the policy we're talking about, whether it's a solution to parking enforcement, or an event district where you have a stadium or a traffic generator, or an approach to managing the curb, an approach to pricing. And then the bulk of each recipe is a case study, where we give you kind of a chronological story from, what was the problem they were trying to solve? What was the impetus behind this policy? What did they actually do? And then what outcomes have they seen? Wherever possible, if we were able to find real kind of quantitative outcomes, we tried to include those in the case study. For almost every one of these, I think we conducted an interview with someone at the municipality or the agency that implemented the policy. So we were getting their firsthand insights. Um, and then lessons learned. um, these are not all just kind of neat pat perfect best practice profiles. These are real stories of a community that tried to do something to solve an issue related to parking. So sometimes you have pilot projects that came to an end and were discontinued. Some of the case studies feature observations about things that maybe didn't go perfectly, things that are maybe a goal for them to continue to iterate on and work on going forward. um, what's next for this project? We're hoping to add more recipes. You will see, I'll briefly screen share from the actual document so you can see the layout. Um, but we have basically released chapter 1 out of 5. And it's actually very clear when you go to the website and you go to the citations page, and there's TBD for chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. That was deliberate. We wanted to start with curb management, which is sort of a hot topic right now. In fact, in the news this week, and a little preview, you'll see something in our upcoming newsletter about this. New York City talking about, should we price our curbs? These conversations are happening all over the country in a big way. Um, so we wanted to really prioritize curb management as a topic, but we have a goal to expand on this with recipes for managing off-street parking. How do you incentivize shared parking, things like that. Include some recipes related to how do you tackle parking mandates, including maybe incremental ways of getting at them. If your community isn't in a position politically where you're going to just, wipe the slate clean. State level policy to enable good parking practices and to preempt bad ones. And then aspirational policies, things where, we think the ball is going. Um, we're looking at ideas to remix some of this content, package it in different ways, to really do some policy storytelling around what's possible and what's desirable. Maybe pull out subsets of case studies that target a particular type of community or type of issue. Update the existing content. We're going to try to keep it fresh, in addition to expanding the number of case studies, and we can always use your help. This was in large part a volunteer initiated project, like so much of the resources that PRN has been able to put out into the world. So if this is the kind of work you would like to be involved in, like, don't hesitate to contact us. You can email me, Daniel at parkingreform.org, with something as small as just an idea for a case study. Hey, I'd really like you to write about this thing that they did in my town. Or if you'd like to volunteer some of your time and effort, that would be always, always appreciated. Um, I will stop sharing my slides. I do feel like if I'm talking about a document that we released, I have to briefly show you the document. So I'm just going to screen share directly from it. This is the Parking Reform Policy Cookbook, um, with a little bit of intro. And basically what you see here is chapter 1 out of what will eventually grow quite a bit. We hope. So recipes for on-street parking management. And you can see kind of the range of things that we've tackled in here. We did a large brainstorm, what policies should be included. Haven't hit every single one that frankly should, and definitely haven't hit every single community out there that is doing something cool and worth writing about. So this is going to be a resource that grows. But you can see sort of the range, from parking occupancy sensors, license plate reader enforcement, getting at how do you actually measure and regulate what's going on the curb physically, to things like how do we deal with freight delivery, reducing the impact of that on our streets, valet and shuttle parking, event districts, issues around ADA and accessibility. And every single one of these links to a case study where you get a little bit of location, a little bit of context, um, and then really kind of storytelling around here's a problem that a community was facing, here's what they did, and here are some takeaways and some outcomes that they've experienced. These all have citations. The citation page is on our website. I suppose if I click an external link from a PDF, my screen share isn't going to follow that link, but I'll turn off screen share because you all can download this if you haven't already. These are cited. The citations aren't pretty, but we did our homework. You can find a lot of follow-up information if there's a program or a policy you want to dig into. And as I said, for almost all of these, there was firsthand interview research conducted as well. And so that leads me to my segue to our guest presenters here, because this project absolutely could not have happened without our 2025 summer intern, Danny. They did a whole lot of the legwork, wrote about half of the case studies that are in this first edition of the cookbook, interviewed people, got on the phone with people, did really tremendous work to make this happen. So thank you so much, Danny, and glad to be able to celebrate that effort today. And Nani Wolf, longtime PRN member who is so much of the good work that we've been able to do at PRN is due to volunteers. And Nani came to us and said, "Hey, I've got some time and would be interested in volunteering some energy for you guys. And I love researching and writing case studies." And we'd been kicking around an idea about, well, we need to do a collection of case studies. We need more curb management guidance. So Nani and I had a number of conversations. This project would not exist, absolutely would not exist without her. She was the one who gave me the idea of framing it as a cookbook, using that language of recipes, and really helped shape what the product became, and really helped identify most of the case study communities, and bring her practitioner's experience as a planner too, I think, to how this could be a useful resource. So I'm actually going to turn the floor over to Nani here, because I'm interested in that last question there, I'm a planner by training, but I've never really worked as a planner. You have. So from that practitioner's mindset, I'm curious, um, why is the format of this guide what it is? How do you see it being useful, both to the people actually implementing parking policy on the ground, and to the community advocates trying to push for better parking policies?
Thanks, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for also having me here today. So the format of this was really geared towards planning practitioners who need a sample to communicate to their legislative bodies about, that gives a demonstration of how parking reform was implemented, and also a clear and concise way to communicate the benefits and pitfalls of a particular action. I found that when I was I still am a planning practitioner. I now work for the City of Ann Arbor DDA, which happens to manage our paid parking system. But prior to this, I was a consultant for McKenna Associates, which served a bunch of different communities all across Michigan. And I was the day-to-day planning administrator for 7 different communities of all different sizes, land use compositions, political proclivities. And in each of them, time and time again, on-street parking management is a consistent problem that arises. And something that I realized just being a planning practitioner is that when you encounter a problem that is not well documented, meaning it's not something like zoning, where there's a million different case studies and articles and academic papers and books on it, then what you tend to do is call the first community that you can find that is comparable or in any way similar to yours and ask them about their experience. And this can happen for a wide range of things. Parking, in Michigan, it's something that comes up whenever we have a new law, like marijuana was legalized in Michigan, and suddenly we're all calling each other up, being like, hey, what'd you do? Did it work? What didn't work about that? Everything's a mess. So having those kinds of clear, concrete resources that say, hey, this is a community that did this. This is their size. This is their urban or rural context. And this is how you might be able to translate those learnings to your own is something that I think all practitioners need and will make good use of because it saves you the time and energy of making those calls, of figuring out who's done it before you, and gives you a clear path forward. And having it written in a way that is short and concise adds an extra layer of benefit where you might be talking to a council member who has never thought about license plate readers in their entire life, or maybe is hearing from residents about ADA accessible parking, but doesn't know exactly what they're talking about. And you are given the tools and the language to talk about it in a way that brings everyone onto the same level. So those are the kinds of things we were thinking about when we were considering the format and the audience of this work.
Very well put. Thank you. I also, like I said, I want to give a big shout out to Danny Harden-Ramella, who was our summer intern last year and did a huge amount of the work on this. So just to give Danny a chance to present to us too today, I'm just curious, as an up and coming professional in planning, what was your introduction to parking reform, and what sort of sparked your interest in that as a topic?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you all for having me. Thank you for having me as an intern. It was a great project to work on. My interest by taking a class with a PRN member, Brian Davis, a site planning class. He essentially assigned us 6 parking lots in downtown Portland and said, what is the highest and best use of these parking lots? And that was our term project. So over 2 months, we spent as students trying to find ways basically to get out of working on this thing, but he challenged us to say like no, leaving it as a parking lot as we initially pitched because we were students is not the highest and best use, and he challenged us to think about the environmental impacts of leaving it as a parking lot, the public health impacts, and these are all things that I prior had been thinking of. And so working on that project really
I hear you, Danny.
started me on the. Oh, sorry, Daniel. Are you talking? No, you're muted. I am hearing things.
I'm not sure if I'm the only one having that problem.
Oh, yeah. So that started me learning about parking reform, and at the end of the quarter, Brian suggested that I apply to the internship. I read what the project was going to be about, and realized that even if it was something that I didn't personally end up working on, I knew it was something that would be incredibly helpful to a lot of folks. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to work on it. It's been tremendously helpful in just finishing out my schooling at PSU, and hopefully will continue to be helpful in my planning career.
Thank you so much for the time that you worked with us and your efforts on this, and for those thoughts. And thank you, Brian Davis, for Danny's presence at PRN. Brian is another PRN member, amazing planner, just brilliant mind. Who is
We're getting them. We're getting them in school. Yep, we're recruiting them at the before they even enter the profession and get corrupted.
That's the right time to do it. um,
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Danny. And I'm super amazingly proud of you and can't wait to dig into this and hear more about this resource.
Thanks, Brian. I think, the most important thing in my mind is taking questions from our audience here about the tool, about use cases for it, feedback about what you would like to see, with the understanding that this is a resource that's going to grow and develop. I think the only other thing before that I kind of had on my agenda for our panelists to talk about was the process of identifying these case studies, which was something that Nani also really took the lead on. And I do think one of the tricky things about something like parking policy, where it's so local and situational, and it's, there is no centralized database of where stuff is happening. There's not always a really obvious way to like simply the question of like, what are the good case study communities? Where are the best practices happening, and how would we know? Was not straightforward. So, Nani, if you could talk a little bit about what that process was like of identifying who and what to profile.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, there's no central repository. I think PRN might be the central repository for the mandate reforms. But yes.
We're hoping to expand beyond mandate reforms with exactly that. Our mandates map now tracks parking benefit districts and on-street reforms, and there's not a lot there yet, but that's a major goal. So yeah,
Yeah.
we would love to be the central repository.
Um, but yes, so what Daniel said is absolutely correct, especially for curb management, which is that there is no central system reporting on which communities have done which things. So the first thing we did was we reached out to the PRN membership and solicited case study options. So if somebody had an idea of an on or off street case study that they were interested in, we offered that up. The second thing that I think was Daniel and I putting our heads together, him more so from the curb management side, me more so from the off street side, and just thought about all of the different categories of reforms that we'd be interested in doing case studies on. And maybe this is, I've heard of this reform in Seattle, I'm curious where else has done it. Or I experienced this in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, what other cities have done this sort of off-street reform? So just taking the knowledge base that we had through exposure through our work and creating a list of reform actions. And then it was about finding places beyond the common answer where those reforms have actually happened. So I think a lot of us know there are star cities who are doing lots of different reforms, things like Seattle, Portland, Dallas, even smaller cities that have common reforms like Baltimore, and thinking about what is the geographic spread that we are interested in having to make this cookbook most effective, right? Because I think where a lot of parking policy runs up against problems is where a larger, oftentimes denser or even more democratic city has done a policy, smaller or rural places look at that and say, I don't see how that could apply to me. I don't understand how, like, if Seattle does it, that's not relevant for me. And that's something I experienced as a practitioner too. If I was working for Plymouth Township, Michigan, which is a suburban, car dependent place that is out of, completely devoid in their minds of any connection to a place like Portland, they would immediately dismiss something. So I set a goal of trying to find a really wide spread of communities that have lots of different conditions. So a wide spread in terms of states, in terms of population, and in terms of like land use context and political context, which sounds a little intimidating sometimes. And in all honest respects, this was a project that took a lot of Googling. And I think it comes down to understanding the keywords that will help you identify the local news article that talked about their meter rate change, or the local news article that was talking about license plate readers, or the city council minutes that might have contained information on ADA accessible parking, and targeting states that you are interested in finding that reform within. And you might not find it. It's possible that you look throughout the entire state of Louisiana and nobody has done an ADA accessible parking reform that you can find online. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it might not be available somewhere. So maybe you then switch your focus to look next door, right? We're looking in Georgia instead, but we're still trying to spread that geography out to cover as much of the United States as we could. I wish you all could see my browser history. It is the most insane thing of all time. So it's a combination of using the institutional knowledge of folks on the PRN team and practitioners like myself to get a foothold into the concepts that you want to research, and then really diligent detective work on like a state by state basis to find the communities that have done this work. And I know that's not the most systematic research procedure that exists out there, but for this kind of really disparate, reform, especially on street reform, that was what we had to do.
I think, yeah, one thing that, like Nani, the range of communities that you looked into or had some knowledge of or had a lead on and then Googled like crazy. I think that's actually something that you'll folks will see more in the future editions of this. It's certainly something that we prioritized in our discussions, and you see some of it in this edition. You're also, spoiler alert, you do see Portland, Oregon 3 times, but I think that was really well put about especially the ways in which local practitioners, maybe especially local electeds, think about policy innovation. Like, well, that can't be relevant to me. Well, I'm not. That's a big, dense, cosmopolitan city. That I can't port that from there to here. And often you can. Um, and we actually de-emphasized, I think, from an earlier draft, some of the community context info that was like, this is what the climate's like, this is what the population density's like, this is how much of the population bikes to work. Because I think sometimes opponents of reform will use that sort of thing as an excuse to say, not relevant to us, we can't do that. We're not like that place. Um, but the geographic spread, the desire to find comparable case studies. I would love to get to the point where this outgrows its status as a PDF because it would be too long and unwieldy, but where we maybe even have multiple case studies for certain policies that are really core. So you can see, here's a small town that did it. Here's a tourist-oriented place that did it. Here's a suburb that did it. I would love to be able to get to that point. I think we could take some questions here, and I see a couple in the chat. I did put a link in the chat to our recommendation form. That also lives on the cookbook download page. But by all means, if you are aware of a community or program you think we should cover, drop that in there. Or even kind of, if you don't have a ton of detailed information, but you'd like to see something covered, crowdsourcing is awesome. I'm going to briefly take Tim's question, as I think then I'm going to pitch a couple of the other questions to Nani here. But to what in general is planned in terms of the growth of this resource, I think one thing, more case studies, including possibly duplicates for some of the core policies, but also the areas that we haven't really covered in this first edition are off-street. So things including creating district parking, public-private partnerships to, municipally manage privately owned lots, create centralized parking for a commercial district or a neighborhood so that it takes the onus off of individual property owners to each provide that parking. That would be one example. Other approaches to parking sharing, policies that attempt to disincentivize asphalt wastelands, essentially. Things that sort of unlock efficiencies in parking management so we can actually reap the benefits. Because we all know communities that have eliminated their parking mandates and that are still way, way overparked. Because not all the incentives on the ground shift when you do that, to actually get to efficient management of both off-street and on-street parking as a system. So I think there's a lot to be done in identifying the best practices for off-street and profiling those. We'll do some case studies on mandates reform as well. We just didn't prioritize that because we already have a lot of resources on that. We already have the reform map, which documents 4,000 communities that have reduced or eliminated parking mandates. So I think there was less of a need in that sense. Anyway, those are some sort of areas where we're looking to grow this resource. Some kind of specific policy questions that I see in here. Nani, would you want to take a stab at Wendy's question? Who wrote, my question is always, what's workable for outer suburbs where it's car dependent in a community that's new to parking reform? Either what we've looked at that speaks to that or how you might approach. I guess how you would encourage an advocate to kind of think about arriving at good answers to that question.
Yeah. And Wendy, my apologies. I don't know if you're referring to on-street or off-street reform. Hello. Would you like to clarify?
In Australia, we're just starting the conversation. So I'm in outer suburbs, and the councillor goes, yeah, but we don't have enough parking. So that's where our place is. So I'll take anything, but I'll take anything. There you go.
Yeah. So I guess I will talk about off-street parking for this case because I think for a lot of outer suburbs, there may not even be a formal on-street parking management program if you don't have like a downtown center or anything like that. So um, for I'm going to give the example of Plymouth Township, which is an outer suburb of Detroit, near where I live and work in Michigan. When we were starting talking about this with Plymouth Township, the first thing we emphasized is there is enough parking. It might just not be in the area that you perceive it to be of the greatest locational benefit, meaning you might want the parking to be right in front of the business that you're currently going to, and maybe it's not there, but the actual total amount of parking that you have is more than sufficient, and highlighting things like shared parking agreements, facilitating off-peak parking agreements between different landowners, and ways that you can kind of hack or reconfigure the off-street parking system to shift where parking is available for different land use needs, where people want to see it available. And I think those kinds of low cost interventions are a good place to start in suburbs, especially where they might be nervous about something like eliminating mandates altogether. That's a good way to start to say, like, hey, let's talk about not necessarily the quantity of parking, but where we're seeing bunching and where we're seeing empty lots and how can we spread that out across the system and make it work more efficiently. The other thing, I don't know if Australia is similar, but here in Michigan, a lot of our outer suburbs are, we would say, lower density and also often more opposed to new development than our urban centers. And I found that in messaging for places like this, it was more effective to highlight the trade-off between parking and open space or parking and the cost of stormwater infrastructure, the cost to the taxpayer, than it was to highlight things like, oh, removing parking mandates allows us to build new affordable housing because that is not something that is motivating to them, right? They're motivated by lowering tax costs or tax cost to the taxpayer and providing more open space. So I think tailoring your messaging in those communities to those types of benefits is a really effective way to get started. Is that a good summary? I hope
Yeah,
so.
that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Is that level of detail in the cookbook?
There are communities that are suburban in the cookbook that are great samples, but these are for on-street management practices. The off-street management handbook will be coming soon. However, I will say, I know there's another PRN presentation coming up for the National Planning Conference here in the United States that's happening in late May. And we will be doing a session specifically on messaging for different political contexts. So I'd be happy to provide that information after that one concludes.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
I can tackle a couple of the other questions that I see in the chat here. Um, to Zoe's question about jurisdictions with multiple regulatory bodies, and specifically mentions the University of Virginia, which has their own parking permit program. That's an area that's really interesting that I think that the answer is yes, and yes, we want to get into that further. There are a couple recipes in this initial run of them that involve institutions, specifically universities. I know there's one from Champaign, Illinois, home to the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, that looks at how a city program responded to issues of parking demand surrounding the university in terms of residential permits, in terms of temporary visitor parking. So kind of worked with the large institution to deal with what are the spillover issues outside of campus. We
I,
have
I
another.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
go
I
ahead,
was
Nani.
also going to say we also have the County of Arlington, which is a multi-jurisdictional area right outside of Washington, D.C. They have a lot of complicated layers of governance over there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, as always, to interested in requests, interested in suggestions. And I think some of the innovation in terms of parking management happens at institutions as opposed to municipalities. We certainly know that. I think in the future, one thing we may look at is stuff like cash out programs too, which a lot of those are associated with big institutions like a university or a hospital. Um, Tim, I answered your question number one about where we're going next with this resource. You asked a second one, and I did post in the chat there, but residential relieving pressure on residential curbside parking by creating agreements with the owners of existing lots to use them at times of lower demand, so schools or churches. That's certainly something I think that's in our spreadsheet a little bit, that kind of thing, and it's something we'll continue to look at. Yeah, we have a massive brainstorm spreadsheet, including a lot of what may be up and coming for this. In general, what I'd say about those kind of shared parking agreements, because I think they're an area of huge potential, but also a lot of kind of difficulty. Like there's a lot to dig into in terms of case studies. What we find in general is that it doesn't happen where it needs to be agreements between private landowners. Because people just don't want to encumber their land in that way. It creates difficulties going forward. So, where you have unused parking that is in private hands, like whether that's a church or whatever, and you want to get that into use during those off hours, typically you need some sort of an intermediary. So we've seen that happen through the market, where landowners will essentially contract with a third-party management company to manage a parking lot that they own as a pay lot. Or you see it where the municipality plays that intermediary role through kind of a public-private partnership. We have some good examples. Again, on deck for a future release of the cookbook of municipal management of privately owned parking. So I think in general, that's where the potential is for that kind of sharing and unlocking that underused parking resource that already exists.
And I'll just pipe up for a second and say that the local conversation around that, the Lancaster Parking Authority figures very prominently in the discussion. And the idea would be that any agreement would be enforced, monitored, patrolled by parking authority staff.
Gotcha. Yeah. Ruben asked, does anyone have any personal favorite policies that they studied for the cookbook? And I'll put that to Nani and or Danny. And I can expand the question a little bit. Either favorite policies, or was there something interesting or surprising that you learned in the process of researching for this?
I know this is a super cop-out answer, but being kind of newer in the planning field and really just being in like a student, it was interesting to study, honestly, all of them. We had this huge spreadsheet, and we kind of just picked the ones, or at least I got to pick the ones that were very interesting to me. So all of them were incredibly fascinating. It was also helpful because for most of them, if not all of them, there were folks who either were involved in getting the policy passed or worked at a worked in an office or was a planner for the policy. So getting to do that like ground truthing aspect of it was just fascinating, hearing how people's journeys and basically put them in position to either help this policy or see its effects now. So that was honestly just really cool to learn from all the folks I got to talk to, and obviously working with Daniel and Nani. So not one policy in particular, but all of them were incredibly cool to work on.
I think I do have favorites for different reasons. One of them is the license plates reader enforcement case study, which studies Palisades Park, New Jersey, which is like a suburban strip area of New Jersey. And the reason for that is the story surrounding their license plate reader enforcement program is so clear and so well covered by the news media because it was so controversial that I think it makes for a really fun and interesting read. And then my other favorite is the Arlington County, Virginia coverage of charging for ADA accessible parking, because I think this is something that every city encounters in the discussions about either removing mandates, like if you remove mandates, how will you provide ADA accessible parking on the street? Or do we charge for ADA accessible parking on the street at the same rate as metered parking? It will always come up no matter what. And Arlington County did this so long ago and has learned so much since they did that I think it's really useful for everyone who's entering those conversations.
I knew you'd have favorites. I think that I think we've had all the questions that were posted in the chat, and we're just a little bit past our 45-minute mark here. I don't have a hard stop. I'm happy to take more questions if anybody wants to unmute yourself or use the Zoom little raise hand button. Otherwise, definitely happy to get the first version of this out. Happy that it will be a work in progress and a growing resource. And excited to collaborate with our members and all the expertise in the network going forward to make this as comprehensive and as useful a tool as possible. So we always welcome feedback, requests, suggestions, whatever you got. And share it. Please spread the word about this.